Any thoughts, Emily? 4 words. That was all it took to make every English word I had ever learned disappear from my brain. It happened during a Monday morning team meeting. There were 8 of us sitting around a conference table. My manager, Sarah, was walking us through a new plan for one of our biggest clients. I had been at the company for about 7 months, long enough to understand what was going on, but not long enough to feel completely comfortable speaking in meetings. Usually, I listened, I took notes, I nodded at the right moments, and if someone asked a general question, I waited to see if someone more senior would answer first. It was a system. And honestly, it worked pretty well, until that Monday. Sarah had just finished explaining the new client strategy. She clicked to the final slide. "So that's the direction we're thinking of taking," she said. Then she looked around the table. "What do you guys think?" A few people glanced at their laptops. One person took a sip of coffee. Nobody answered right away. I looked down at my notes. I had thoughts. Actually, I had several. I wasn't sure about the timeline. I thought one part of the plan might confuse the client. And I had noticed that we were making an assumption about customer behavior that wasn't supported by the data we had. But I didn't say anything. I was still trying to turn all of that into one clean English sentence. Then Sarah looked directly at me. "Any thoughts, Emily?" My brain stopped completely. I knew every word in the question. Any. Thoughts. Very easy English. A beginner could understand it. But suddenly understanding English and speaking English felt like 2 completely different skills. Everyone turned toward me. I looked at Sarah, then at the slide, then back at Sarah. My brain started throwing random sentences at me. "I have some thoughts." "No, too strange. I think maybe there is something." "Something what?" "Something what?" "I don't know." "Absolutely not." 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4. It felt like 30. Finally, I smiled and said, No. I think it looks good." Sarah nodded. "Okay," and moved on. That should have been the end of it. But for the rest of the meeting, I was annoyed with myself, because the truth was I did have thoughts. I just hadn't been ready to package them into perfect English in 3 seconds. After the meeting, I went back to my desk. My coworker Daniel stopped beside me. "You got quiet in there," he said. I laughed. I completely froze, because Sarah asked what you thought. "Yes." Daniel looked confused. "But you had an opinion, right?" "I had like 5 opinions," he laughed. "So why did you say you didn't?" "Good question." I leaned back in my chair. Because when she looked at me, I suddenly felt like I needed to say something really smart. Daniel smiled. "You don't." That sentence stayed with me. "You don't." He pulled over a chair and sat down. When someone says "any thoughts?" in a meeting, they're not asking you to give a TED Talk. I laughed. It feels like they are. They're usually just opening the door. That made sense. Then he said something even more useful. "You also don't have to start with your final answer." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You can buy yourself a few seconds." "How?" He thought for a moment. "You could say, 'My first reaction is,'" then he added, "or one thing that stood out to me was, I wrote those down." He continued, "If you're still thinking, say, 'I haven't fully thought it through yet, but,'" I looked at him. "You can actually say that?" "Of course." "That doesn't make you sound unprepared." "No, it makes you sound like a human being." "Fair point." I looked back at my notes from the meeting. There was one question I had really wanted to ask. The proposed timeline gave the client only 2 weeks to review everything. I thought that might be too aggressive. Daniel pointed at my notebook. "What would you have said if Sarah hadn't put you on the spot?" I thought about it. I guess I would have said, "The timeline seems a little tight." "There you go." "That's it?" "That's it." I stared at him. I had spent 4 years studying English. Apparently, what I really needed was someone to tell me I was allowed to say one normal sentence. A few days later, we had another meeting about the same project. This time, Sarah showed us an updated plan. I was prepared, maybe a little too prepared. Before the meeting, I had written 3 possible comments in my notebook, not because I planned to read them, just because knowing they were there made me feel better. The meeting started. We talked about budget, then staffing, then the launch date. About 20 minutes in, Sarah pulled up a new slide. "We're thinking about moving the client review to Thursday," she said. Thursday? That was even earlier than before. Immediately, I had a concern. But before I could decide whether to say anything, Sarah looked at the group. Any thoughts? My body had the exact same reaction. Heart faster, shoulders tense, brain suddenly interested in everything except English. But this time, I remembered what Daniel had said. I didn't need a perfect answer. I just needed a place to start. So I spoke before I could talk myself out of it. One thing that stood out to me was the Thursday deadline. Sarah looked at me. Yeah? Okay. I was still alive. I continued. I haven't fully thought it through yet, but I wonder if that might be a little tight for the client. Sarah looked back at the timeline. How so? This was the part I used to be afraid of. A follow-up question. But strangely, once I had already started speaking, it was much easier. They usually take at least 3 or 4 business days to review our first draft, I said. If we send it Monday and need feedback by Thursday, I'm not sure that gives them enough time. Sarah nodded slowly. That's a fair point. Then another coworker jumped in. Actually, they were late on the last review too. Someone else said, could we move the internal deadline earlier instead? And suddenly, everyone was discussing it. My comment hadn't been brilliant. It hadn't changed the future of the company. Nobody applauded, but it had started a useful conversation. Sarah changed the timeline before the meeting ended, and something clicked for me. For months, I had treated any thoughts like a test. I thought there was a correct answer. I thought I needed to sound confident, smart, fast, professional, but most of the time that wasn't what people were asking for. They just wanted my perspective. Sometimes my perspective was only, that timeline feels a little tight. Sometimes it was. One thing that stood out to me was, sometimes I needed a few seconds so I could say, I haven't fully thought it through yet, and sometimes I genuinely had nothing useful to add. That was okay too. A few weeks later, Sarah asked me the same question in another meeting. Any thoughts, Emily? This time I didn't panic. I looked at the slide for a second and said, my first reaction is that option B looks simpler for the customer. Then I explained why. No racing heart, no completely blank brain. Well, almost no racing heart. I was still me. But I had finally understood something important. Sometimes the hardest part of speaking English at work isn't knowing the vocabulary. It's believing that you have to sound perfect before you're allowed to speak. You don't. You can pause. You can think out loud. You can start with, my first reaction is. One thing that stood out to me was, I haven't fully thought it through yet, but those little phrases give your brain somewhere to begin, and once you begin, the rest is usually much easier. So now, whenever someone in a meeting suddenly looks at me and asks, any thoughts? I still feel that tiny moment of panic, but I don't automatically say, no, looks good, not anymore. Because sometimes I really do have something to say. I just need a few seconds to find it. If you enjoy learning the English people actually use in real meetings, real offices, and everyday life, subscribe to FluentTrail English. We'll keep learning it through stories like this. See you in the next story.